Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, thanks for joining this afternoon. My name is Nicole Gaines. I am the director of the NIMAC, and I'm joined this afternoon with Liz Schaller. She is the new NIMAC manager, and she will be helping out if there are any questions provided through the chat. We will have plenty of time for questions. That's my hope this afternoon. And she will monitor the chat. And if you could stay on mute if you're not asking a question, that does help to prevent a lot of background noise. This has already, I think, been the quietest group. So congratulations on your initial achievement with today's webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. I do want to let folks know before we dive in, though, that the webinar will be archived, and so will the PowerPoint. So if you're interested in these resources going forward, they will be available to you, hopefully within the next day or so. So basically what we're going to do this afternoon, there are two parts to today's presentation. The first one, I'm going to give a PowerPoint and talk about a few NIMAC basics, some policy updates, talk about a few of the main features of your publisher account, the file review process, and then we're going to do a live demo in the system, take a tour of a publisher account, and look at the main pieces of functionality there. So, and then like I say, we will have time for questions. In terms of the focus of today's presentation, this is going to be a little bit more of a higher level look at how publishers work with the NIMAC, how states work with the NIMAC. If you are involved in the more technical side of producing NIMAC files and submitting them to the repository, we encourage you and invite you to join us. Next week, we're going to have kind of a second part to the webinar series for publishers and conversion vendors. And the webinar next week, again, it will be offered twice. It's the same webinar, but it's going to focus on creating NIMAC files, the file validation process, and FTP deliveries. So if that is something that you work with, please join us next week for that. So in terms of NIMAC Basics, if you work with the NIMAC, you probably have some familiarity with this, but maybe not with all of the specifics. But the NIMAC itself is funded through the U.S. Department of Education, and we were created legislatively, which is kind of unique among projects at OSEP. And OSEP stands for the Office of Special Education Programs at the Department of Education in D.C. So IDEA 2004, which is a primary piece of legislation for serving students who are served by special education in K through 12 in the U.S. That's the piece of legislation that created the NIMAC, and it also formally created the NIMAC specification. So we did not exist before IDEA, and neither did NIMAC. The files that we receive from publishers are made available to the states to use in producing accessible formats for instructional materials. And to date, we have received about 63,000 files from 151 publishers, and all 50 states, plus 7 outlying areas, work with the NIMAC. So in terms of the way IDEA set things up, it didn't require that states work with the NIMAC, but all 50 states have chosen to do so. It's just a really good way to support their systems for delivering accessible formats to kids who need them. When states coordinate with the NIMAC or sign up with the NIMAC, they basically agree to do 3 things. The first one is that they will start asking for NIMAC when they purchase new textbooks. They will abide by the eligibility requirements that are set out in IDEA, as well as in copyright law. And they will also designate the authorized users for their state to access the files in the repository. So another important piece of this, it has to do with the NIMAC file format, and it just has to do with the way that NIMAC has been implemented kind of at the national level. The access to the repository is fairly centralized, and what this means is that while states designate authorized users to access the repository, download files, this is a relatively small group of individuals who have direct involvement in producing accessible formats and getting them delivered to qualifying students. So we differ from some other national services. If you're familiar with Learning Ally, if you're familiar with Bookshare, those are both national organizations that provide accessible materials directly for use by students. And Bookshare actually works a lot with NIMAC, and they actually are a primary provider of NIMAC source digital materials to eligible students. But because NIMAC itself is a source file format, we are not in the business of distributing those directly to schools, directly to students, and directly to individual teachers. They are distributed to folks who produce files like Braille, large print, EPUB, DAISY, digital audio, whatever formats are needed by the student. So NIMAC, again, it is the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard. Again, it was also created by IDEA, and it's XML-based, and it's based on the DAISY standard. There was actually a National File Format Committee that got together in the early noughts and sat down around a big table or several big tables and tried to figure out what is going to be the best standard format to produce a variety of accessible formats. And what they came up with was NIMAC. So again, it's the whole purpose of NIMAC is not to go directly to the kids, but to produce accessible formats that the kids need. An important aspect of the scope of NIMAC, as set out in the legislation, is that NIMAC is the only format we receive. It's the only format that we can receive. So, and that's something that, as with many of the aspects of the NIMAC, can only be changed when IDEA is reauthorized or through a legislative process. So if you are someone who's directly involved in NIMAC production at your company, you are probably well aware that NIMAC isn't something that is automatically generated when you're creating a print book. It can be challenging to create ballast NIMAC files using off-the-shelf tools, and for that reason, virtually all publishers that work with the NIMAC, I think I can count on 2 fingers the number of publishers who have decided that they were going to provide their own NIMAC files, and in both of those cases, the number of files was pretty limited. So generally speaking, conversion vendors who are more specialized in these conversion services are the ones that are actually doing the work. The NIMAC itself, we don't endorse specific vendors, but we can provide a list of active vendors who have submitted files like in the last year and a half upon request, if that is ever useful to you. When it comes to producing NIMAC, and again, we'll get a little more into the weeds on the technical side during next week's presentation, but if you are involved in this, I just want to point out that there are 3 essential resources that we hope that everyone is familiar with. The first one, of course, would be the NIMAC specification itself. The second one is the DAISY structure guidelines, and the third is the NIMAC metadata requirements. So all of these are your basic resources for producing the NIMAC file. With regard to the materials that we receive, we actually are permitted under the legislation. Again, this is another definition that is handed to us right in IDEA. But we actually are able to accept a wide range of student-facing materials, including textbooks, workbooks, supplementary readers, and ancillaries. Because of the way the material that is appropriate for NIMAC is defined in the legislation, they do need to be materials that are required for use by students in the classroom. So this means that categorically exempt would be teachers' editions or other materials that are exclusively used by the teacher and not distributed to students for use in the classroom. And we've actually had inquiries from publishers over the years who have been willing, and they say, well, we know that sometimes teachers have print disabilities or visual impairments and may need an accessible format. And we're always very encouraging to say, you know, we really encourage you to provide another alternative to your customers for those materials, but we aren't able to accept those into the NIMAC. One important change that I'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about some policy changes is that we are actually able to accept NIMAC for some digital instructional materials as of earlier this year. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, as I mentioned before, when states work with the NIMAC, they agree that they will ask for files when they obtain new textbooks. And under IDEA 2004, this is actually the only mechanism to require NIMAC from the publisher, is through that adoption contract or purchase agreement. And I will say, I just want to kind of give a shout out, though, that we actually routinely reach out to publishers, and request NIMAC when there is a need and we don't already have the file. Part of what is very tricky for us is that we have no involvement at all in that procurement process. And obviously there are 17,000 school districts across the U.S. There would not be any way for us to keep track of who has purchased what, even if we wanted to, which we actually don't want to have that level of involvement. But what this kind of means is that it's impossible, and it's often impossible for a user to know as well. If they are at an instructional resource center, they just know that a kid in District B over here needs a large print book, and a kid over in District A needs a Braille book, and they need a file to produce the materials that those kids need. So we are we're very fortunate, and we're very grateful for the support that we've gotten for publishers over the years to provide NIMAC upon request when there is an identified need, and for whatever reason we haven't already received the file. But that said, the reason that the adoption contract piece is so important is that the real goal of the NIMAC and the benefit is when we can have that file already available when a need is identified, so that there's not a lag time. Part of the issue with NIMAC as the file format is that it takes some time to produce it, and depending on the publisher, we might get a turnaround time of a week for that file. It might be 6 weeks, it might be 8 weeks. There's just a wide variation there. So to the extent that we can get those files, before an identified need, that is really what we want to have happen, because that just makes it a lot more likely that that Braille reading student is going to have their book on the first day of class like everybody else, and it's not going to be the middle of October and they're still waiting for their book. That's what we don't want to have happen. So the next thing I just want to mention in passing is that IDEA does have specific eligibility requirements, which states and the organizations that they designate to work with the NIMAC must observe. And there are two pieces to this. The first piece is that the student must have a qualifying disability, and IDEA actually points to the National Library Service to the blind and print disabled, to those eligibility criteria for that part. And students must also have an individualized education program, which you may be familiar as an IEP, which indicates that they do receive special education services. So those are the two pieces for eligibility. The NIMAC is not directly involved in determining eligibility. That is something that does fall with the states, districts, or the agencies that they work with to provide the materials. So the last thing I want to talk about in this section is just that because NIMAC is a source file format, it can be difficult sometimes to know, well, if I get a call from a customer and they say, well, I'm looking for Braille or I'm looking for audio, where do I send them? We know that the NIMAC itself isn't going to be able to provide that specific format because we only have the NIMAC files, but we are more than happy to help to get your customers connected, whether the format is already available out there or if they need to work with their state system to get a format produced. We are more than happy to help. And I also just want to make a plug for the Louis Plus database. This is a great national resource that includes accessible materials that are available from over 100 organizations throughout the country. And I have the link up here, but if you just Google Louis Plus, you can find it on Google. And this is a free service that's provided by the American Printing House for the Blind, so that primarily to reduce the duplication of effort. It's kind of like we want to ensure that if an accessible format is already available, that somebody else in another state can benefit from that format and not go out there and use resources to produce something if they can obtain it already made from someone else. So that's kind of the original goal of Louis Plus, was to help states to meet the needs of students and avoid that duplication of effort. So but we are more than happy to help. And it's always fine to have your customers give us a call, send us an email, and we can help them get plugged into their, like I say, to their state system if a format is not already available. So the next thing I want to talk about are just a couple of policy updates that may be of interest to you. The first one has to do with the Marrakesh Treaty. This is probably something that's been on most folks' radar for the last few years. It was really pretty exciting, pretty big deal in terms of serving folks with disabilities. If you are not real familiar with Marrakesh, basically it's an international treaty that makes it easier for countries to share accessible formats, including Braille and other formats, across borders. That was kind of the goal of it. And it just happened that when Marrakesh was ratified in the United States through the Marrakesh Treaty Implementation Act, that they did make some changes to copyright law. And a couple of the new terms, the primary terms that are relevant for the NIMAC are eligible person and accessible format. They took the place of some earlier definitions. And because IDEA 2004 points to the eligibility guidelines of NLS, as I mentioned earlier, what this means is that those guidelines will be changing to align better, or to align period, with the new changes that came under the Marrakesh Treaty Implementation Act. In practical terms, what this basically is going to mean is if you're familiar with the former NLS guidelines and the categories of disabilities, one of the categories that had been really challenging is that there was this ancient category that was called reading disability due to organic dysfunction. And this was very antiquated language from, I believe it might have even been as old as the 1930s when the original NLS regs came out. And so basically there was this category of disability, and the way that the earlier guidelines were written, a medical doctor had to be the person to designate a student as eligible under that category, or an adult is eligible for NLS services under that category. And so this was problematic for states in that, you know, a lot of families couldn't afford to take a kid to the doctor just to say, yeah, it looks like you've got a reading disability due to organic dysfunction. And then there were a lot of medical doctors who were just like, I'm really not even sure what you're asking me. This isn't my area. So what's really kind of good about the changes is that NLS is taking a fresh look at what those guidelines are, and they're going to be coming up with guidelines that make a little bit more sense in the light of what we know now about reading disabilities and who are the most qualified professionals to make that determination. So the long and short of it for the NIMAC is that the NLS is in the process of drafting new guidelines, which they hope to have in place by early next year. And then the NIMAC itself will update our agreements with states and users at that time. And not to get too far into the weeds and the policies and procedures, but the NIMAC does have legal agreements with every state at the state education agency level when they coordinate with the NIMAC. And then we also have legal agreements with every user who has direct access to download files, basically, you know, requiring that they observe the eligibility requirements, copyright, and so forth, that everybody plays by the rules, basically. So we will be updating those and sending those out to everybody once that new language is in place at NLS. So the second policy update that I wanted to share has to do with NIMAS for digital instructional materials. In May of this year, the U.S. Department of Education published a notice of interpretation that clarified that the definition of print instructional materials in IDEA includes digital instructional materials. And this was a departure from the interpretation that they had originally, which was a much more strict interpretation of the definition that printed textbooks and related printed core materials related only to hard copy printed books. That was kind of the original thought. With the change in the K through 12 educational environment, with the transition to more digital learning materials, there was kind of a change in philosophy at the department regarding this question. And basically going forward, the NIMAC is able to receive files for digital content when that content can be supplied in that valid NIMAC format. One really key question with regard to this, or important caveat, is that the NIMAC file format itself, which was, again, it's now quite an old format, again, based on the DAISY standard, which is designed to capture the content of printed books, and that file format is not changing. So when we think about the terminology, just digital instructional materials in the classroom today, this can include a wide range of different types of products. If you have digital materials that are composed primarily of static text and images, and also that have an ISBN, because we do still, at this point, we are not changing the metadata requirements for NIMAC files either. Those materials can generally be converted into NIMAC without a big problem. If it's something that you provide, it's just a simple HTML page, or it's just a simple PDF, that kind of content we can handle. But digital products that are highly interactive, because you could say, well, this is digital instruction materials. That could range from software, videos, games, a range of materials that you really just can't turn into a NIMAC file. So basically, we're currently working with OSEP and the National AIM Center to start developing guidelines both for publishers and conversion vendors, and also for states around this change, because there are just some important caveats here. And actually, as a publisher that works with the NIMAC, you will have received recently a survey and the survey actually just recently closed, but we got a lot of good feedback from publishers and conversion vendors regarding their questions about this change. And we will definitely use that kind of as a springboard as we're thinking about what needs to happen next in terms of clarifying what this change means for folks. Another important aspect of the notice itself is that it did indicate that digital materials that meet established accessibility standards, and the notice references WCAG 2.0 AA, that those will be exempt from NIMAC. So the really positive thing from our standpoint is that it provides the NIMAC an opportunity to accept NIMAC for digital materials that are not otherwise accessible, so that we can provide that as an alternative. But it also provides a kind of more of a stimulus for publishers to really be focusing on that accessibility right outside of the box. One thing, to not get too much more complicated, one thing that we do have to kind of keep in mind is that we really want to promote what we've always talked about as the market model, to try and serve the most students possible through the product that's actually distributed directly for use in the classroom. That's really what we want to do. But another thing that we are working on developing guidance around is that we know that today, in the world that we live in right now, there are still a proportion of students, and it's a tiny group relative to all students, but students who are Braille readers, they still rely very heavily in K through 12 on embossed Braille. And so in many cases, that is still the appropriate format for them. It's still the appropriate learning medium. And so one of the things we're also trying to tease out is, how can we ensure, if we have these digital materials that they are compliant, but we still need to produce Braille, how can we kind of work with publishers on that? So anyway, you will be hearing more about this. We will definitely be in touch as we go forward, and we get more guidance in place with this. In the meantime, if you have specific questions or anything that you would like to share, if you participated in the survey, or if you didn't participate in the survey but you'd like to provide feedback, feel free to get in touch. We're very interested in your input and your questions. So before we move on to the demo portion, I just want to take a few moments to talk about a couple of last pieces here, and that is what the role of a publisher account is, and then the file review process, because those are generally things that folks are interested in knowing more about. So again, we'll talk more in detail, or we'll actually kind of kind of show you a little bit more in detail when we get to the demo part. But we make accounts available to publishers free of charge so that they can meet their obligations for NIMAS and work with the NIMAC repository. And the accounts that we provide allow for several pieces of functionality. They do support the upload of smaller files directly to the NIMAC system, up to 250 megabytes. We do know that some files are larger than that just because of the technical reality of upload speeds with the average bandwidth and so forth. We generally recommend, sometimes you can get a 300 megabyte file to upload, but FTP download is, which we're going to talk about more next week, that's generally going to be your option if your files are over 250 megabytes. You can also search your own inventory, view your own inventory, or download your own inventory. And you can export inventory reports at any time. You can create additional accounts for either for your conversion vendors or for other folks at your company. And you can download the NIMAC Validation Wizard, which is a small standalone program, which we will also talk more about next week. And you can also generate correctly formatted OPF metadata using the Excel to OPF tool. So to be accepted into the NIMAC, there's actually a two-part process. One of these is an automated validation that happens upon upload, and then the second is a manual quality and metadata check by the NIMAC staff. The way that the system works is that if you are the primary account holder, or who we refer to as the super user for your account, you will automatically receive an email with a digital certificate number for each file as it is certified. And this is just your proof that the file was accepted into the repository. And those numbers can also always be accessed in the full record or in your inventory report if you go in and export an inventory report. As an aside, if you have extra folks that you would like to receive those emails, you can actually choose to have up to 3 additional email addresses added into your account information that will allow them to receive the emails as well. And that could be a conversion vendor or someone else or a group email. But if you're interested in that, just let us know. We can take care of that for you. So in terms of the manual review by staff, we will, a big part of this is that, if you're familiar with NIMAS, there are several different components, and one of the most important things is that we want to make sure that that XML file looks like it matches the title page and copyright page PDF, and that the metadata match both of those. So we want to make sure that all of the components appear to be for the same textbook. And then there are some additional checks that we do, for some, not just for the metadata, but there are a few kind of basic checks in the XML that we look at. One thing that's really important to note is that we do not receive printed books, and even if we did, it just would be not feasible to do a page-by-page comparison to evaluate the specific tagging in the XML. This is why the DAISY structure guidelines are so important, that those are followed, because there's not an automated way for us to determine that. Maybe someday in the AI world of the future, we will have a beautiful machine that can do this for us. It doesn't exist yet. So the other caveat here is that it's very rare, but it is possible that at some point you may have a file that was certified, it passed, it's all good, but we get a report from a user down the road and they say, I'm encountering an issue with this file. And so, if something like that happens, we will get back in touch. But I will say that our average of reports of issues with files is less than half of 1%. So of files downloaded. So it's very rare. It's not impossible, but it's very rare. Now, if an issue is identified, however, in the file review process, which is actually not uncommon. There may be an issue that needs to be corrected. What we will do is we will send you a detailed email about the correction that is needed so that the file can be corrected and resubmitted as quickly as possible. Generally speaking, and we'll talk again when we talk about the batch process next week, we'll talk about the automated report that goes with that. But the feedback that we are generally going to send is going to be to the person who delivered or uploaded the file, because that's what our system is able to track. And if you send things by FTP, your FTP login is associated with your email address, and it's really kind of cool because we have a fancy system now that can actually track that and let us know and say, hey, that file was submitted by batch delivery by such and such person. And that's actually super helpful because it means that we're not spending a lot of time trying, scratching our heads and trying to figure out now who submitted this and, who should we send the feedback to. Most of the time, unless we've been requested not to do so, is that if the person that submitted it was a conversion vendor, we will generally, as a courtesy, also copy the primary account holder just so that they'll know that, hey, we're reviewing your files, there's an issue, we're waiting to get it resolved, just as a kind of a courtesy. In terms of the file review timeline, the time for a delivery to be reviewed and certified really is going to vary a lot. And I know that this is always a frustrating thing if I hear something like this and it's like, okay, you don't really want to say the file time review timeline there really isn't one because it varies so much, but it really does. Just to give you an example, last year we received over 9,000 files. And this was not anything special that we did. It just was an accident of adoptions for reading programs, and we got a bunch of great programs, and we ended up certifying over 3 times the number of files that we receive in an average year. So that was great. We were happy to see them. But obviously, if we receive thousands of files at once, it's just going to take a lot longer to work through them. If we are having the time of light submissions, you might see that your file gets certified the day it was uploaded to the system. So there's a lot of variation, and it can take a couple of weeks or longer if we are receiving a lot of files, or if the files have a lot of, if there are problems with it. One thing that we do say is that if you have a deadline with a particular customer, we strongly encourage you to submit the files at least 2 weeks in advance of the deadline, just so that if there is any kind of problem, you'll have plenty of time to make the corrections and we can get those certified for you. Also, we generally certify the files in the order that they come into us, but if you do have a deadline you need to meet, let us know, and we're happy to prioritize those files. Same thing, if you know of a customer, if you have a program that you are in the process of submitting and you know that Tennessee is waiting for the grade 3 textbook and workbook because they've got a kid who needs Braille, please let us know. We are always happy to prioritize any file that there's an immediate need for. And then the last thing I just wanted to note is that our website, if you have never been to our website, it's nimac.us, and there's actually a specific page just for publishers and conversion vendors, which is where this webinar will be archived, and you can also find other resources. So I encourage you to take a look at our website if you haven't visited there recently. Okay, well, I am going to move on and do a live demo now, but before we move on to that, I just want to see if there are any questions. I know we've covered quite a bit, so I want to just take a little bit of a break here in case anyone would like to ask anything about kind of the information portion of the presentation. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any text, and I don't think anybody has turned their mic on, so I think we're good. So I'm going to go ahead and move ahead here, and I am currently on the NIMAC login screen. I'm going to log into a publisher account, and if you happen to be a conversion vendor, one of the things that I'll just point out, actually both for publishers and for conversion vendors, is that this is the interface that you're seeing right now is for publisher users that are in a publisher role as opposed to a conversion vendor role. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but if you're a conversion vendor, you may notice that, oh, there are some pieces to this system that I don't see when I log in, and that is because there are different kind of rights and permissions for accessing your inventory and your account if you are a publisher user versus a conversion vendor user. And like I say, I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a moment with that. I want to start out here, though, and just talk about the landing page when you log in. Your landing page is always going to be your entire inventory. And you'll notice that there's a search box up at the top. That does not search all of the NIMAC. If you are logged into your account, it's only going to search your own. But if you ever have a need to search all of the NIMAC, you can always do that just by going to the NIMAC website, nimac.us, and click Search the NIMAC without logging in, and you can search the entire repository. But this search is only for your own stuff. And same thing with the filters that you'll see over on the left-hand side. Probably the most important filters for your purposes, if you're looking at your inventory, is the very first one, and that is status. There are 3 statuses of files in the NIMAC, and these line up with the file certification process. The first category is uncertified. When you upload a file to the system, it automatically appears in that category, and that indicates that it is in the queue for review. Stalled inventory, those are materials for which there was some kind of identified issue. We have provided feedback to the conversion vendor regarding the problem, and we're waiting for the file to be resubmitted. And then the third category, of course, which we don't actually have any in this test account for, is certified. And those are files that are good to go. They are visible to users, and they can be downloaded from the NIMAC. So up here in the upper right hand, you'll see that there are other functions here that are static whenever you're working in the system. Add new content, that is that feature that I had mentioned in terms of if you want to upload a file directly to the system. Transform Excel to OPF, again, that's an optional tool that we'll talk about next week. The resources page, I'm just going to click on that real quickly to show you again that this is where you can download the Overdrive NIMAC Validation Wizard, which we do ask that folks do as a preliminary step before you upload any file. It basically just saves you time because the file will be rejected if it fails this validation process, and it just means you can catch the errors more quickly. And then reports here, you are able to do reports. If you are a publisher user, you can download you can create a report of downloads by NIMAC users. And this is one of the features that actually conversion vendors do not have. The other two are they are not able to create additional users, and they are not able to download your inventory. So those are the 3 things that a conversion vendor cannot do. My downloads, this is where you would go if you actually downloaded your own inventory. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the next thing that we're going to go into in detail is your user information, and this is where you can find your primary account information for your company, and also any additional users or sub-users that you have created. Before we jump into that, I just want to note that if you want to return to your landing page at any time when you're using other features in the system, you can do that by either clicking the search button with no search terms, or you can click the logo in the upper left, and that will take you back to your landing page. It's just kind of a nice thing to know in terms of navigating in the system. So we're going to go up here to user information, and one thing that's really important to note here is you can view your user information here, but it is not editable. And this was something intentional that Overdrive recommended when we created the new online system. They said, you know, it's really better to have those changes come through the staff, and so that's what we implemented. You can change your password here, but if you need to change the primary contact or any location information, if you have a technical contact, that's an optional contact that you can have in addition to the administrative contact. And then this is where you'll notice if you do have additional email recipients set up, this is where they'll show up. If you're in need of adding new users to your account, the thing that's really nice about this is that it's very quick and very easy. When you go into this feature, it will show you anyone who is already set up as an active sub-user. You will not see yourself because you don't see yourself as a sub-user. You will be the primary account holder if you are the primary account holder. So, but to add a new user, you just click Add User, and all you need to know is their first name, last name, and email address. And when you save the changes, they will be emailed a login and password, and they can access your account. So probably the most important point again is under user role. This is where you choose whether or not you're going to set them up to full access to your account or the more limited vendor access to your account. And one thing that I will say is that if you change your mind about that, or you want to change that, you actually, for your active users who you see down here, you do have the option to edit those accounts. So if you ever decide that you want to make a change, you can go back in and you can edit that at a future time. Another thing that we do recommend, just as a matter of housekeeping, is that if you are a publisher who uses different vendors, a lot of different vendors, if you have a vendor that you're no longer working with, you know, it's a good idea to just get rid of that account, you know, because they will continue to have access to your account. These accounts do not expire, and you can create as many of them as you like, but it just means that the housekeeping part is up to you. So the next thing I want to talk to, I'm going to jump back to our main inventory here. And as I mentioned before, one of the features that it can be really, really useful is over here on the right. You'll see here again that in this test account, we only have 6 files. It's not very many files, but you might find when you go into your inventory, you might have thousands of files. You may have hundreds of files. You may have a lot of files. So one of the things that's really nice, you may be thinking, well, why would I ever want to search my own inventory? There actually are a few reasons. You might want to resubmit a file, or you might just want to generate a report. And so one of the things that's nice is that you can click this export button over here to the right. After a search or on your whole inventory, after you apply a filter, at any point you just create a report on the fly, and it'll save as a CSV file a report of all of the inventory in your search results, or if you're just clicking it from your landing page, your entire inventory. So that can just be, it can be a useful thing to know about. And as we mentioned before, in terms of the certificate ID, I'm actually going to X out of that because I didn't actually tell you what I was doing there, but you can actually get to the full record details from the brief display by either clicking View Title Details or clicking the title of the book. And in this case, since it's a test account, this is not a real file, and so it has not been certified. But you will actually see the certificate ID number at the bottom of the record beneath rights if the file has been certified, and that's just something that is permanently in the system after the file is certified. You always have access to that information. So the next thing I want to just talk about is the Add New Content feature. And this is, again, if you want to upload files directly to the system, you can do that for smaller files. If you have a lot of files to upload, there is no minimum size limit for FTP delivery. Files that are larger, you definitely have to send them by FTP, but if it works better for your process to submit everything by FTP, that's totally fine. You never actually have to upload using the system, but it's an option if it is something that appeals to you. So in this case, I'm just going to navigate to a sample file that I have created for this process. And what will happen, you will navigate to the file, and when you click upload, a couple different things will happen. One of them, and this was actually a very small file, so this happened almost instantaneously. But if it's a larger file, it may take a little longer, because what's going to happen is the validation process will happen and the metadata extraction will happen. If there's a validation error, you should get a detailed message that tells you what the validation error is. If you encounter some other issue, let us know, and we will be happy to try and troubleshoot that for you. So the thing that's kind of nice about using the upload in the system is that it will provide you with a web form here with all the metadata that is pulled out of your OPF. You can make edits, you can add, you can remove things from this screen, and when you save, the thing that's kind of cool about this is that it will also save those changes to your OPF. So any change that you make either at the initial upload or if you go in and edit your metadata later, it will automatically save those changes to your OPF, so that new data will travel with the files that are uploaded by NIMAC users. So that's just kind of a helpful thing to know. Another thing that I want to just note is that add new content is only used when that ISBN does not yet exist in the system. And this is something that can be kind of confusing sometimes, but if you have made a correction or just say, hey, we have a new printing, I really want to replace the older file with the new printing, totally fine, just let us know. But you would use replace zip file, which is located over here to the right of the brief display for that purpose. Add new content is specifically designed to prevent duplicate uploads. So if the ISBN or the identifier is already in the system, what you would want to do is just use the search box and search for the ISBN. Or again, if you have just a limited inventory, you can just scroll through and find the record and then just choose replace zip file instead. Edit metadata, again, that is an option that is available to you if you only need to make metadata changes and you're not actually uploading an entirely new zip file. There are some issues occasionally that only affect the OPF, and actually that's something that NIMAC staff also routinely do. You uploaded a file, the title page shows second edition, that wasn't included in the metadata. We can go in and add that in. It's saved to the system, it's saved to the OPF, and it's all good. We don't even need to let you know that it happened, and it's quick and it's easy. So if you find that there are metadata issues in your own inventory that you want to correct before the file is reviewed or what have you, you can do that. One caveat I do want to note is that in terms of the inventory, again, that we see here, we're seeing these options to edit the metadata and to replace the zip file for uncertified installed inventory. If you have a file that has already been certified, you won't see these options here because we don't want you to accidentally overwrite something that there's not any issue with. So kind of to protect the inventory that's already certified, if you need to make a change, if you need to resubmit, just let us know and we'll move that into stalled for you and it can be edited from there or replaced from there. And we're happy to help with that. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is the fact that you do have access, if you are a publisher user or the super user, to download your own inventory at any time. And the way that you do that is you click Add to My Downloads, and you'll basically see the same options that NIMAC users will see. You can download a file set with images or without images, or you can download just that title page and copyright page PDF. I don't know that there's any reason that a publisher user would want to do that. It's offered in the NIMAC system just in case somebody wants to just verify for sure before they download the full file that that is actually the textbook that they want, that that's the one that they need, that the student is using in the classroom. So, when we submit that request, then that sends a request to the server and it goes and it copies the file that's on the server and delivers that up to the My Downloads page. And that's where you can then see a status here. Under Actions, this is going to show where it says pending here, that will show download once the file has been prepped and it's ready. If it shows pending or processing, that just means that it's still in the works on the server side. One important thing to note about that is that the browser is not smart enough to know whether or not the status changes. So you have to refresh the screen to see when the status changes for that. And we actually see here now that for this title, the button does show download, and we can download it from here. The one that's in the queue above this is kind of an interesting thing that you may not ever run across yourself, but this is what it will look like if you actually had downloaded a file and then you resubmitted the file. the system will let you know that, hey, this download actually isn't the most recent version of the file, and it'll prompt you to actually reprocess the download to get the more recent upload of the file that's in your inventory. So again, this is probably not something that will come up very often for you, but we like to just mention it because we realize that not all students that have a valid disability are included under those criteria under IDEA to receive NIMAC source materials. One real life case that came up for us several years ago was there was actually a student in Canada who needed a textbook in Braille, and the district up there was trying to get some assistance, and that would be a situation where we're not able to help folks in Canada, but the publisher could certainly provide the source file directly to the school or to the district if that was within their policies and procedures to share it in that way. One thing that I do want to note is that when you download a file from the system, it's going to be subject to the same fingerprinting and watermarking DRM as any other file that's downloaded from the system. And what that basically means is that there's a hidden code in the actual file that indicates who downloaded the file, when they downloaded it, and that the NIMAC was the source of the downloaded file. So the reason that this is important is because this isn't a good way for you to get files if you need to make corrections or if you want to update a file, or if you need a copy of a file to re-upload it to your inventory, let us know. We can request an unwatermarked file from Overdrive. They can put that on your FTP. You can use that as the basis of the file that you submit. We basically just don't want you uploading a file that already has that fingerprinting and watermarking on it. It's just not what we want to have in the system. Okay, and then the very last thing, I just want to circle back to the reports that you can do a report of downloads by NIMAC users. It's not real common, but occasionally we will get queries from publishers and they'll say, hey, how many people have used my materials? Or how often has my program been downloaded? And you can actually access that information anytime that you like. And there are a few different options for the type of report that you want to generate. You can create a start date and end date. If you want to start with the very first day that the NIMAC opened, that was December the 3rd, 2006, through today. And then you can also have your reports sort various ways. And again, that's similar to the inventory export. It just creates a CSV file for you, which you can open in any spreadsheet software. So, okay, well, that concludes the demo portion of the training today. I'm going to go back to the presentation here just to get to the last screen, which is always our contact information screen. And to just let folks know that we do encourage you. We welcome your calls. If you ever have any question about anything really, status of your files, feedback provided, we're at NIMAC@aph.org. We are all working remotely for the most part now, but we are still keeping up with our email. We're still answering the phone, 877-526-4622. Our office hours are 8 to 4:30 Eastern, but we are, leave us a voicemail, send us an email. We will get back with you as soon as we can. If you're on the West Coast or somewhere else and, it's after East Coast business hours, we promise we will get back with you. We will. So anyway, so that concludes the presentation, but I'm going to go to the chat, and also if anyone has any questions, just let me know. It looks like there's a question from David. Oh, and actually, if folks are getting ready to head out, I do want to just note that Liz has just put in the chat a link to it's just 3 short questions. It's super, super quick. If you would please just respond to this survey. It really does help us in terms of putting together webinars for the future and, in terms of what works, what we could do better, what you're interested in seeing in the future. So we really appreciate if you can just take a minute and respond to that. So question Here, for curriculum products that include a variety of supplemental materials, how is it determined about what pieces should be produced as NIMAs for the NIMAC? That is a really excellent question. And basically, what it really gets back to is that there's not really a definition for core. Core, because, and just to back up a little more, IDEA says, textbooks and related printed core materials. And so that core piece has always been kind of wobbly. And it's really been, to be honest with you, it's been kind of the negotiation between publishers and customers. I will tell you from experience that there are some publishers who have a much stricter interpretation. And then there are others who have a much more open interpretation, and they're like, hey, this is student-facing material, and we're going to, we know that kids are using it in the classroom, we're going to provide it. So I can tell you from our standpoint, as long as it's student-facing and isn't in an excluded category, like a teacher's edition, we're happy to take that material, but it really just kind of depends. The way that it, in theory, the way that it works is that you just basically provide what is in the contract. But sometimes I think those contracts are not very detailed, or they may not actually itemize, like, well, here are the 30 things, the 30 components from the program that we want you to submit in NIMAS. And so I think sometimes it can really just be a judgment call. But I would say, if you feel like it's core material, if this is something that is generally going to be used with the core curriculum there, we're happy to accept it. Any other questions? Okay, all right. Well, thanks everyone so much for joining this afternoon. And like I say, if you are on the more techie side of things, please do join us next week, where we'll be really getting into the weeds with the file submission and other more technical questions regarding the NIMAS files. So thanks again. Appreciate everybody attending today.
Thanks to you.